Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Good morning to all of you. I welcome you to the Hindu analysis. Today we have an interesting set of topics out of the Indian newspaper which we have to cover, and they deal with different aspects of international relations and economics. So first we will discuss a very interesting text and context article which talks about how the executive control and the legislative control in the US works when it comes to wars. Then something which is not per se favorable for India and in a way has implications for its national security, which is China and Pakistan and their space cooperation. We know that the individual program of the Pakistanis is not very good, but when it comes to Chinese support, it is quite interesting how this is manifesting itself. Then one of the most landmark deals other than the FTAs which have happened with the US and the EU, with the US, EU and now with New Zealand, a whole set of FTAs are now waiting for ratification in specific areas. We'll discuss what are the contours of the New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. And then SEO, static is important here. We'll talk about a new initiative for Urdu language and literature, equally important. Then two developments, the Atacama Desert and how there is a lot of light pollution which is happening there, and also the revamping of the members of the NITI Aayog. Now, as you know, this is a set of questions, topics which basically cover both prelims and mains, and some topics have what we call as a pure prelims perspective, some have prelims plus main, and we will discuss them in that same context. I'll try to give you questions which you can write also. One thing which you also have to understand is when you look at the editorials which were there today, mostly irrelevant for UPSC per se. One was purely written from an, you can say, anti-establishment perspective, made no sense per se. And the other one was again about AI and school curriculum, draft rules. So therefore, two text and context articles and a mix of topics out of the Hindu newspaper when you look at the Delhi edition itself. Now, before we begin, remember that the 16999 offer is going to end soon. This is our Civil Services Day offer, and you can get this with certain, you can say, extensions also. So do use this opportunity to become a part of the Unacademy family, and you have to use the code IAS English to get the best price possible. Using IAS English is extremely important. Now, let's discuss the first article. Good morning. Can we start? Everybody is here? Yes, sir. Yes? Okay. Now, we all know the saga behind this concept, which is that we know that Israel, US, Iran have been engaged in a war. There is a very fragile ceasefire which exists today. And at the same point of time, we also know that this engagement is now going to touch close to 60 days, which is 2 months. And at the same point of time, there were no real targets which the US used or created before it entered this war. It was a push by the Israelis to remove one of the biggest actors which was balancing it in the Middle East, which is Iran, as two nuclear powers. And at the same point of time, the US has done a lot of damage to the Iranian military and a lot of establishments have been destroyed. But Iran used the fragility of the global supply chain and the Strait of Hormuz to then create a lot of leverage. Be it Strait of Hormuz, be it attacking the US allies in the whole sector from Qatar to Bahrain to UAE to Saudi Arabia to hitting the refineries. Iran has played out this war well vis-a-vis knowing that the global supply chain is much more important, and the US in turn has been in this war too long without really getting anything out of it as of right now. They will say that our war aims have been covered, but what were the war aims, nobody knows. And there's a whole churn which is happening within the Pentagon as of right now, because a lot of the military generals were not ready to accept what Trump was saying. And it was an executive action. Trump is part of the executive branch of their government, and there was an executive action. Now, as you would know that in modern states and a nation state concept, there is also a concept of check and balance. We have a lot of safeguards and check and balances in our constitution where the legislative, executive and the judicial branch Specifically, executives come out of the legislature itself. So there's a lot of accountability per se. So executive responsibility to the legislature is extremely important. But in India, there is more than what it should be, or because of the British model which we use, there is a lot of executive responsibility to the parliament. However, the US, when their constitution was written and with the principles it was written, there was a lot of emphasis on what we call as branch independence, meaning the executive and the legislature and the judiciary should be purely independent. So executive responsibility per se to the Senate and the US, you can say, assembly is in a way limited, but over a period of time has increased, and that is where this article comes through. So the background to this is about separation of powers, but at the same point of time about interconnected responsibilities and overall understanding. Now, in the US, before Nixon, because the president, our president is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but he or she cannot act independently. But here, because the president is considered to be and is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, executive action was enough to go to war and declare war and do treaty. This was something till Nixon, it was very common. However, when they got embroiled in the what is called as the famous Vietnam War, and Vietnam War was again a war in which the US got involved in the larger context of the Cold War politics. They again did not have really any goals. They bring in Diem. The idea was to take the Ho Chi Minh Viet Cong, to destroy the Viet Cong. It took them quite a lot of time. And Nixon, who was the president at that point of time, wanted to push this war beyond Vietnam into Cambodia. And that is where there was a point of disagreement between the US Congress and Senate. Congress is basically the Lok Sabha, Senate is the Raj Sabha. The Congress and Senate was not in agreement with Nixon that we should further go into Cambodia with this understanding to remove communism or the socialist understanding within the Southeast Asian sector. That is where there was an act or resolution which was passed by the Congress and the Senate, which is called as the War Powers Act or War Powers Resolution. Now, this is a very interesting piece of legislation. This has a context in the Vietnam War itself, the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And the idea was that the executive has to be responsible to the legislature, to the Congress, and before entering the war, there are multiple provisions here. Before entering the war, the Congress should be notified. Every 6 months, you have to tell them what is happening in this war. And if they enter a war without notifying to the Congress, within 60 days, that notification has to happen. If the Congress does not sanction that war at the legislature level, then that action of the US president is considered to be null and void, and the US president has to come out of that war because there is no Congress sanction for it. So basically, it's a check and balance concept. So when Nixon was being checked by the Congress, he did veto that bill, but the Congress limited the presidential power to wage war. And the core principle is to create an understanding where there is consonance and there is consent of both the people's representative and the president of the United States of America. So therefore, there is a very simple straightforward concept under the WP Act, which is that War Powers Act says that the president has to seek authorization from the Congress for continued military force beyond 60 days of involvement in any place. Now, are we reaching the 60-day mark for this war? Yes or no? Come on, tell me. Are we reaching in the Israel, Iran, US understanding? Are we reaching this 60-day mark? Anushka says yes, very good. So we are nearing this 60-day mark. Now, did Trump do any of the following which was mandated by the WPA Act? Let's check. The first thing which the WPA Act says, or the War Powers Act says, that President, before he goes into hostility on foreign soil, should consult in every possible instance. I think you understand that he did not take the Congress dominated by the Democrats as of right now into consideration. It requires the President to report the Congress within 48 hours of deploying the force, and the Congress itself should have passed a law. Neither happened. Once he entered the war, he has not formally notified the Congress till today that he is at war with Iran. Should at the same point of time, this 6 months clause does not go into context because it is only going to be 60 days. But this is a very important clause which Trump is basically not following, which is, if 60 days pass after the president's first reported deadline to the Congress, the use of US military and its assets is automatically terminated unless Congress has declared war or passed a law. And a grace period of 30 days is allowed if the president wants to notify the Congress. So let's be very clear. We are nearing this 60-day mark. Maximum 90 days he has, and Congress still has not been notified, still has not been taken into consideration by President Trump. Now the question is, what are the implications? Once the 60-day mark is crossed, Trump's action will be considered constitutionally illegal within the framework of the Constitution of the US. However, there are too many gray areas here. Now, why are we having this discussion? And this is a very important point we have to understand. We are having this discussion. We don't need to understand the constitutional working of the US. That is not what UPSC is going to ask. This is a understanding underlying of how a state works, separation of powers work, and check and balance work. Meaning, when there is an essay, when there is a GS paper 2 question, which basically deals with governance and talks about alternative models of check and balance and what we call as legislative and executive branch coming together or having some form of accountability, this is a good model. That even war has to be sanctioned by the Congress. But to be very clear, Trump has not cared about the Senate or the Congress previously. To be very honest, Trump is Trump at the end of the day. Therefore, when you look at the, you can say, larger contours and the precedents which exists for something like this, nothing will happen in the US as of right now. Why? See, firstly, there is no agreement. Is 29th of March, or rather 29th of April or 1st of May, which is that 60-day mark? Firstly, nobody knows this because the exact date of engagement is not being considered. Further, the Democrats are also confused about this, that is a ceasefire considered within the 60 days or not considered within 60 days. Further, if not, then there is no precedence, be it Libya, be it Yemen, be it Iraq, and be it Afghanistan. In none of these cases, the Congress, be it from Nixon to Obama, none of these cases, for national security reasons, the Congress was not notified and this 60 days clause was not brought in. So therefore, the overall outcome of this is only going to be this clause being quoted to Trump. Trump will ignore it, and thereafter he will move on to do what he's doing in the Israeli sector, in the Iranian sector, and therefore this act shows you that if there are loopholes and gray areas within a constitutional mandate, the executive can use it against the legislative mandate. Simple, straightforward concept. It is not something to be learnt by heart, but it has to be understood by principle. So what we have understood in this article, what is the takeaway for you as a UPSC aspirant is not, see, you have to understand, not every news has something which is relevant for the examination. We have to take out the relevant portions. And therefore, it is about accountability, or rather we'll say governance is the, and branch separation of power. Separation of power is the underlying logic and underlying concept here. The US created a regime where through the WPA Act, they created a regime where there is executive responsibility when it comes to war. When it comes to war, the legislature, which is basically their Congress, there has to be some form of accountability. However, because there is no precedence per se, no actions previously, in that context, what happens is Trump may ignore this with no real consequence. With no real consequence. Now, how will UPSC frame a question? How will UPSC frame a question? Very simple, straightforward concept. When UPSC frames a question, it can basically deal with the static understanding, which is that the executive's responsibility, be it independent or collective, is the cornerstone of legislative process or parliamentary democracy. Do you agree? Now here, because the US is not a parliamentary democracy, it is a presidential system of democracy, you can say that even in a presidential system, this is a cornerstone. It is not specific to parliamentary democracy per se. We have a different model, they have a different model, and therein you can give an example here. You can talk about India vis-a-vis the US. Yes, executive responsibility, collective or independent, is very, very important in parliamentary democracy because the executive should have the mandate of the people's representatives, the MPs. But that is how a structure where the prime minister has supremacy or de facto power, that is how it works. But in the US, where there is presidential democracy, in that also they're trying to push for executive responsibility. When they're trying to do that, which means that in a way, a cornerstone of our democratic process is executive responsibility towards legislature. I hope you understand the static underlying concept, the base concept here. Right, this is a governance questions, GS paper 2 type question. They will never ask you how does the US constitution work. That is not how UPSC frames questions, because you are not going to become an IAS officer in the US. You're going to become in India. And therefore, you need to know how these powers work. Right? Anushka says, yes, sir. Okay, great. Now, the second article which we have to cover, the first I hope is totally clear. It is about a static concept of executive and legislative responsibility. Now, see, we know that China has a very, very advanced, you can say, space program, defense program, but space program is equally advanced. India and ISRO, specifically ISRO, has done more than what it could in the limited budget which it has. And recently there have been setbacks with regards to multiple satellites not being pushed into orbit, and there are delays which are also happening as of right now. We've discussed that in previous CNAs also, that there is a little bit of a problem which has emerged, needs a little bit of more attention, and how does the commercial and the state functions of the ISRO get balanced and managed is a separate issue altogether. But Pakistan is a rival nation. It has always competed with India. And to compete in space technology does not always need an army or non-state actors or a terrorist state. It needs intellect, it needs a lot of conviction that you want to do something within the ambit of scientific development, state responsibility, and also not doing illegal activities. Now, China has made a point in order to undercut the US and specifically also India in the Indian Ocean world. As part of its Belt and Road Initiative, it tries to export space cooperation also. And that is where this article actually, in a way, maps a new development and also tells us what has happened previously in this relationship of China-Pakistan cooperation. So the context for this article is that China has recently selected two people, two Pakistanis, out of which one will go into the manned space mission of the Chinese as a payload specialist. Now we have our Gaganyaan program. That is our manned mission, you can say, program for the ISRO. But Gaganyaan, everything, the technology, the capsule, the re-entry, Vyoma, you can say the training which is happening in Russia, we are doing it independent. Pakistan has got a shortcut, and that shortcut is that the Chinese are ready to send one Pakistani astronaut in the Tiangong space station. Now they will obviously argue that though an Indian has already been into space, they will act like this is an independent concept, but purely based on Chinese cooperation. 1990, first Pakistani satellite was put into orbit. Pakistan is purely dependent on Russia, China, or even North Korea for its space program. But the idea is Beijing is doing space diplomacy and space politics, if you want to say, by allowing a Pakistani to go into the, you can say, orbit or go into the LEO before, I think, Gaganyaan will be actually operational. So it's a matter of egos, it's a matter of diplomacy, but it's actually a long-standing cooperation which Pakistan and China have, and it is mushrooming into something like this. Now again, the finer details of this are not to be learnt, but the cooperation between Pakistan and China is quite old. 1990s is the first, but since 2011 and thereafter, multiple such, you can say, points of intersectionality have been there. For example, in 2011, a communication satellite called Pakstar 1 IR was actually launched with China's assistance. Then iQQ Lunar, a lunar satellite, 2024. Since 2024, there's an acceleration also. A lunar satellite which was developed by Pakistan's Institute of Space Technology and Shanghai University in turn to capture and transmit photos of the moon and the sun. It's a scientific satellite per se. Further, we have PACSat 1, MM1, PRSC1, PRSS1 and 2. The way China has accelerated the Pakistani space program to launch multiple satellites is quite interesting. And this point of convergence now comes with astronaut training in the Tiangong concept. 2 men have been selected, don't have to remember their names, but this is a problematic development because this means India is not just fighting against time, it is fighting against two actors which specifically want to make sure that the Gaganyaan program, whatever its achievements are going to be, are dampened by the fact that the Chinese are giving pure access to the Pakistanis to the space program. Further, what is interesting and equally interesting is this point, which is that for defense purposes and national security reasons, this is a concerning development. Not that the Chinese have not done this previously, but Iran is using this technology as of right now to strike most of the US bases in West Asia, and Pakistan has been given again a lot of access, which is to what is called as BDS, Beidou Navigation System, a very precision driven rival to the GPS, has 2 centimeter to 5 mm precision and allows for defense and civilian use both. Basically, this is their Navik. And when it comes to the Chinese version of Navik, it is very precise, very, you can say, very good integration into Chinese military, but also Pakistani military has pure access to the BDS. There are a lot of reports which are telling that there is a spy ship, a BDS spy ship, which is actually stationed in Iran, a Chinese ship, which is actually giving Iran all real-time, you can say, data. Recently, there was also reports coming that in Operation Sindoor, every fighter jet which took off and every military activity of India was tracked by the same system, and real-time data was actually given to the Pakistanis via China. So this is a little bit of a concerning aspect with our Navik. If you know what happened recently, which is in the Navik program or the Navik satellite constellation, 2 satellites need to be changed. And that is where the efficiency of Navik vis-a-vis the atomic clocks which are there inside it and how BDS works is concerning for national security reasons. So how UPSC would then frame a question for you or ask this point is China, Pakistan space cooperation has both civilian and military implications. Elucidate. Elucidate means you have to give examples. Now, obviously, you can't write this answer without knowing the contours of what is this cooperation. Don't have to learn the names of the satellites, but you should know in what zones are they actually cooperating. This is a very important point you have to understand. Because if they are going to ask you these type of qualitative questions, where a IR question is mixed with defense technologies, mixed with science and technology, you should be able to then write a very good answer in all of these zones. I hope you get this point. So are these 2 topics clear? Potential implications are BRI, Silk Road, space. Yes, very good, Anushka, very good. Are we on the same page? Can we move to the next set of articles? 2 simple straightforward articles have their own context, text and context, that is why it's called. And US and China-Pakistan cooperation has been discussed. Yes, sir? Okay. This has to be a 2-way interaction. If you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat section. Now, the third article is a historic deal between India and New Zealand. Now, a free trade agreement of FTAs, in the context of the US, it is called the bilateral trade agreement, BTA. EU, we have another FTA. So in the larger story of FTAs which are happening left, right and center, New Zealand has been added as the new FTA partner. Now this is important. Why? Because we have been trying to break or rather enter the, you can say, Pacific economy, Australia, New Zealand, for a very long time, and the trade potentialities are quite big, are quite. Now, first you have to understand the quantum of trade which is happening between India and New Zealand in order to understand that what is the implication of something like this. Please do understand one thing, that there is a certain churn which is happening in the overall, you can say, global economy, where multilateralism was something which was considered to be the future of world trade, global supply chain, and all of these things. But there is a trend which has emerged in the world now, that we are going for bilateral agreements, because the world is too complicated. The geopolitics is too complicated for multilateralism to succeed, where multiple actors have to agree. For example, SCO we will discuss. The idea is bilateral trade agreements are now going to be the future and are considered to be more secure than a multilateral agreement. That is where there's a certain ideological shift which is happening, and this is a product of that. Now, the trade which happens between India and the New Zealand sector is increasing, not comparable to the EU or comparable to the US, but has been growing, and to 32.1% recently. For 2024-25, it is $711 million worth, and imports from New Zealand grew by 75% to 587 million in the same period. So we have a positive balance of trade with New Zealand. That is a good thing, that we have a positive balance of trade with New Zealand, because we are exporting more to them than taking in. It's a positive balance of trade. Now, what are the sectors which are going to benefit from this generational agreement, which is going to be, still has to be ratified by the New Zealand Parliament? But in the following things, 0% is going to be there for tariff. Basically, New Zealand has opened all sectors for India, and there is no exemptions or no place where there is no cooperation. For example, textile apparel, leather footwear, engineering goods, plastic rubber, electronics, marine goods, pharmaceutical, agriculture, and chemicals, all zero duty now. And it is believed that for our textile sector, which was having up to 10% previously, this is going to be a game changer. So India has now full access to the New Zealand economy with 0% tariff. But what is more important here is, what has India agreed to with regards to New Zealand imports? This is the important point. New Zealand has agreed to remove all tariffs on all items. We still have created a regime where there are certain exemptions. For example, we said we will immediately remove all tariff on wood, wool, and leather raw hides, which is needed for our economy. In a phased manner, we will then remove petroleum, vegetable oil, and electrical machinery duties. And we will then further reduce tariffs in wine, pharmaceutical, polymers, aluminium, and steel articles. This is going to be done in a phased manner. This is going to be done in a phased manner. India has balance of trade because we are exporting more and importing less. So we have a positive balance of payment and positive balance of trade. When you export more than you import, you have a positive understanding. Now, what are the products which have actually been exempted? Because India needs to protect its dairy industry and agriculture, and that is very interestingly reflected here, which is dairy products, animal products, agricultural products, sugar, artificial honey, copper articles, aluminium, and small bits out of it have all been removed from the FTA. I mean in positive. What is the reason for India has balance? Positive balance. It has, see, New Zealand is an important actor because if we get access to New Zealand economy, we get automatic access to that sector, specifically Australia. Australia, we don't have an FTA as of right now. We're still negotiating it. The idea is, if New Zealand, we get Polynesian sector opens very easily for us. And with zero tariffs, India can then further sell in the Australian sector. And at the same point of time, because the word which matters here, this obviously you understand that they're trying to remove the agricultural sector. The word which matters here is actually called as diversification. The underlying logic here is of course diversification of supply chain. See, this is the buzzword right now. This is the buzzword. See, why we are trying to diversify. See, look at what has happened for LPG, what has happened for LNG, what has happened for oil. What if India had not taken close to approximately 40% of its oil from Russia? Put yourself in the position of the government, and if the diversification of our oil profile had not been done, today we would have been in the position of what Vietnam, Philippines, or other Southeast Asian countries are actually facing, which is that we need to diversify our supply chain. It's not that there are no other countries which give us wood, wool, leather, petroleum, vegetable oil, or wines. It is because in today's global world, in today's global economy, it has become important that you diversify your supply chain, have multiple suppliers for the same product. In that, the problem is that we, for example, for critical minerals, we are trying to do that. We are trying to find actors in Argentina, in what is called as the Latin American sector. So this is part of this idea of diversification, that if we can create a positive channel of trade which is mostly duty free with New Zealand, we can then create an alternative regime to what we see in what is called as the concept of a global supply chain which is based on only one actor. Bilateral trade is important. You should understand that the WTO is more or less dead. WTO is more or less dead. Can anybody tell me what does a BTA actually in a way undercut? A bilateral trade agreement or FTA undercuts a very important concept of WTO. What is that concept, Anushka or Avantika? What is that concept? When I do a FTA, I am basically undercutting that concept of WTO. What is that concept? This is the static portion of this concept. And come on, you know it. You know the abbreviated version of that also. You know the concept, you just don't know how it is related to this. Not dispute settlement. Dispute settlement, as it is, the appellate and dispute settlement mechanism of WTO is dead because the US has not appointed judges to it. But there's a certain concept which India even used to give to Pakistan. It is the underlying logic and the most important principle of the WTO, which basically the BTAs and FTAs undercut in order to create a favorable balance of trade. Yes, very good. MFN, which is most favored nation concept. See, MFN status says that if I am trading with China and I am trading with Pakistan and I am trading with Myanmar and if I am trading with Sri Lanka, if I give one benefit to China, I have to transfer it to everyone. Meaning, most favored nation concept is that if I am doing bilateral trade with some of the WTO partners, if I am giving a specific type of tariff concession to one country, I have to give it to everyone. But these bilateral trade agreements and FTAs actually undercut that concept. They say that, okay, we have bilaterally agreed to remove zero tariff. India does not need to transfer this, you can say, benefit to other nations per se. It is a FTA, therefore we don't need to do it. So please understand this point very clearly, that the implication of something like this, which is a once in a generation historic FTA, is you basically are being asked to understand what is the point of doing an FTA. So when UPSC frames a question, if they frame the question, they have to, in a way, I'll add one slide here. They have to, in a way, go this route, which is the recent FTAs are part of India's attempt to diversify its supply chain and increase its ability to absorb global shocks. Explain, examine, whatever word you want to use. Now, obviously, you can't write an answer with this type of a question without really going into the nitty-gritty of understanding what does an FTA do, what is its relationship with the most favored nation concept, how does it undercut WTO, how does it lead to diversification. At the same point of time, it also allows you to understand how, at the same point of time, this allows us access to markets which previously have been untapped. Will you be able to write an answer for the 3 questions I've given you? I want the body, introduction and conclusion of all these questions in the comment section, because these questions are all based on the principle of using the underlying static knowledge. I hope you have realized that there's a pattern here. All these 3 topics, other than this one, the first 2 had nothing to do with India per se. But it was an implied concept that if the US does this, what is the implication on governance? If in China and Pakistan are cooperating, what is the implication on India? Similarly, what is the implication of New Zealand on India? So when you read the newspaper, you have to go through the newspaper like this only. A lot of students ask how to read the newspaper. You have to keep your static portion in your mind, and then with the UPSC syllabus in your mind, go through the contents of a newspaper. When you go through the contents of the newspaper in that way, you will be able to identify, okay, this is not directly related to me, but it has certain implications for my static. That is why political news have no perspective for us. Election news has no perspective for us, because the politics changes. The constitution remains as it is with certain changes, but the idea is the static portion is your guiding light. Right? Okay. Now, the SEO meet which is happening in the what we call as the sector of Kyrgyz, or whatever, Kyrgyz Republic, the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh has gone for an SEO Defense Ministers meet, and there is a lot of bilateral talk also happening, India and the Central Asian republics. But for you, what is important is to remember this as of right now. The topics which will come tomorrow are going to be more important, which is what was the outcome per se of the SEO meeting. But you should know that in 2001, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, again a multilateral concept which was introduced to undercut the power of the US. BRICS and SEO were considered to be the 2 futures of the world. But the problem is, if you look at the SEO partners, you will realize that it is quite problematic. See, it is India, Russia, China. So India, Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran and Belarus. So in 2017, India joined along with Pakistan the SEO, and Russia added India, China added Pakistan. This is the problem with this institution. India, Pakistan and China, along with Russia, all 4 are in this organization, specifically this trilogy. SEO previously used to be taken as very, very important, very seriously also. SEO was considered very important. But because of this triangulation, over a period of time, mostly things have been blocked. Mostly. SEO is, you will not see the Prime Minister becoming a part of the SEO very readily. And at the same point of time, the SEO used to be a point where cooperation used to happen between India and Pakistan. But since Pakistan will shed blood and ask for water under Indus Water Treaty, this India has said that we will not use the SEO as a point of bilateral agreement or bilateral dialogue. Everything has to happen independently in an independent zone. Cannot happen within the multilateral institution. So the SEO per se has become redundant, much like the Quad as of right now. So there are Quad, SEO have become two institutions which per se have no real points of future. Because the problem is that the way multilateral partners are working together, there is no point of actually convergence or agreement. Convergence or agreement. Now, as I said, we will have more news out of this tomorrow. You should just know the static portion here, SEO. Now, art and culture based news. The Punjabi Wikimedian user group has recently sought to create a Urdu literature digital library. Now, this is an important, you can say, development because Urdu literature in India was quite diverse. At the same point of time, quite, you can say, quite important for the historical context also, because the texts which were written in Urdu captured multiple important moments. But the problem is that Urdu archives are mostly physical and are in very bad shape as of right now. SARC obviously is redundant. SARC, BIMSTEC, BBIN, SARC, because India-Pakistan together, SARC was decided because of India-Pakistan, you can say, dynamics. BIMSTEC and BBIN because of the larger Belt and Road Initiative and how all of that impacted. I was talking about two very, not South Asian organizations, but an organization which was there for South Asia or rather Asia per se. SEO was considered to be an Asian movement in that regard, which is now redundant. So yes, obviously SARC has become purely redundant. Now, Punjabi Wikimedia's user group is saying that digitization of the Urdu archives is important, and multiple points of, you can say, cooperation also coming. The Rekhta Foundation, Jashn-e-Rekhta is organized by this organization. Rekhta Foundation, along with the British Library, they are ready to digitize and give this organization the digital archives of the Urdu language. But the problem is, as of right now, there are copyright strikes by the Punjab government. So there's an urge by this organization that these copyright strikes should be removed. But what is interesting is, as part of this digitization, which is coming from the British Library per se, it has a very interesting text. See, Alif Laila, an Arabic fable, very well known. Previously, there used to be a proper series which was there for Alif Laila. But the original copy of Padmavat, written by Malik Muhammad Jaisi, an Avdi poet, and its Urdu version are also being digitized. Now, this text is extremely important because you would know that it captures Alauddin Khilji's understanding vis-a-vis how he dealt with the Rajputs and the whole story of Padmavati and the Padmavat in that regard. This is a good development. There should be more cooperation like this, and this Urdu archive should be further developed, because this Urdu archive can be extremely diverse and has most of the, you can say, HRA, HSRA, Punjab nationalist, you can say, material. The nationalism of Punjab was actually captured in Urdu. So it is quite interesting that we need to in a way invest in this sector. So let's see what happens, but interesting development. The last two topics are equally interesting and diverse. First, see, the NITI Aayog is being restructured. New members have been added into the NITI Aayog. And previously, NITI Aayog used to be a organization which had a think tank, as it is called, which had a lot of economists. But we are seeing a shift this time because the NITI Aayog 5 members, out of the 3 of the new 5 members, we have health and you can say technology sector representatives enter NITI Aayog. For example, we have Abhay the Karandhikar, M. Srinivas and Gobardhan Das. Mr. Kandhikar is the Secretary of Department of Science and Technology previously, Director of IIT Kanpur and a Professor of Electrical Engineering. Dr. Srinivas was Director of AIIMS Delhi, and Mr. Das was the Director of Indian Institute of Science Education Research, Bhopal, and a Professor in Molecular Medicine at JNU. This is being considered as a shift because the members who are left are still economists, but NITI Aayog was more a place where economists were part. What this has is an implication on larger policy advisory. Policy advisory, the government of India is now trying to bring in domain specialists. Which is a good thing. They're trying to bring in domain specialists so that their understanding of science, technology, and health is made better, which is a good move. So these are new appointments, the diversification of the composition of NITI Aayog, that was interesting and will have policy implications for sure. For a PCS level examination, these appointments will be important, can be asked in the examination straight. Now, the last is a topic of geography plus environment coming out of the science section of the newspaper. There's a desert in Chile called the Atacama Desert, and Atacama Desert is considered to be one of the driest and one of the darkest zones of the earth, which makes it a very important desert for space observation. Now, what this article points out is because of, firstly, too much space observation, and because it is a desert which does not have a lot of rain and cloudy skies, a lot of renewable energy plants and concepts are coming through. It's a cold desert, yes. And therefore, what this article is pointing out is that recently it has become a battleground for scientists and energy firms, wherein recently there was an energy firm which wanted to establish a solar power plant, but the construction activity and these plants, along with the number of observatories which are coming in the Photon Valley of Chile, are doing what is called as light pollution. And in a desert which is dry and dark, which is known for its, you can say, observatory capacity, light pollution is a very, very problematic development. Again, brings in the two concepts together of environmental development and, you can say, energy security and energy development. Energy security equally important for this sector, but the observatory capacity, the fact that we have a lot of multiple, be it, for example, the Parnell Observatory, one of the biggest observatories for, you can say, interplanetary activities and celestial bodies, because of the darkness and the dryness, what is happening is that now this desert itself is under threat. And therefore, the original purpose of the Atacama Desert is going to be then undercut. So you should know where it is, you should know what is its characteristics, and you should know how it is now threatened by light pollution. So What we've discussed today is a set of topics which have a very diverse understanding. From understanding how China and Pakistan cooperation in the space sector has implications for both military and the ISRO in that regard, along with how the US has a act, War Powers Act, which allows a 90 days period in which the president can act independently. Thereafter, it needs Congress sanction. Plus, the idea that we have understood the SCO, the concept of the Atacama Desert, the new composition of NITI Aayog, along with that, how there are implications for the New Zealand and India FTA overall on the trade profile of India. In the past 1 hour, we have tried to create an understanding for this. So if all of this is perfectly fine, I would like to close this session for today, and I will see you soon in class or in CM. Done? Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much. I will see you soon. I will see you on 30th. 30th of April, I have my Conquer Prelim session. If you would know, art and culture for the past 6 months. 30th April, I will see you all. Take care.